What's up, and welcome to Chapter 25 of AMSCO U.S. History, Diplomacy in World War II from 1929 to 1945. Please make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, like, comment, and share these videos with your friends. Thanks! In the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, many Americans were still questioning why they had entered World War I in the first place, so an investigating committee led by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota concluded that the main reason for U.S. participation was really to serve the greedy bankers and arms manufacturers, most of which resided in the Northeast. The committee's work later influenced isolationist legislation in the following years, although it wouldn't prevent another World War and America's entry into it. Foreign policy-wise, Roosevelt promised a policy of the good neighbor, or the good neighbor policy, toward other nations of the Western Hemisphere, mostly Latin America, in his inaugural address. Interventionism started by his cousin Theodore, and Taft's dollar diplomacy no longer made much economic sense because, of course, the U.S. was in depression. Also, militaristic regimes in Germany and Italy prompted Roosevelt to seek these neighbors in cooperation to defend the region from possible dangers from European countries. He implemented these policies through several actions, for example, a Pan-American Conference, which was a conference of many nations in Latin America and throughout the Western Hemisphere, also the rolling back of the Platt Amendment of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, and also new deals with Mexico. Early on in the war, the U.S. actively aided Britain, much like it had done in World War I, and Roosevelt knew that the United States might soon enter the war, so he set up a secret meeting with the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill aboard a ship, and they signed a document known as the Atlantic Charter. This basically included principles for peace after the war, so there wouldn't be a World War III, and this included things such as self-determination for all people, no territorial expansion, and free trade for all the nations in the world. These guidelines seek to make the world a safer place. Also during this time, the majority of Congress was run by senators and representatives that were isolationists, so they didn't really want to meddle in the affairs of countries around the world. As a result, they passed a bunch of neutrality acts to sort of prevent U.S. involvement in these other countries. One was the Neutrality Act of 1935. This authorized the president to prohibit all arms shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of nations that were deemed to be at war. Another act in 1936 forbade the extension of loans and credits to belligerents, and in 1937, the act specifically forbade the shipment of arms to opposing sides in the Civil War in Spain, which had broken out a year earlier. When the war started, the Roosevelt administration decided to adopt a less restrictive Neutrality Act, which basically said that any nation at war could buy U.S. arms if it used its own ships and paid cash. This way, the U.S. wouldn't be involved in possible trafficking of arms, and the ships would have a less chance of being sank. And this was called the cash and carry policy. It was technically neutral, but it strongly favored Britain. Later on, Roosevelt even proposed to end the cash and carry requirement and permitted Britain to obtain all the U.S. arms it needed on credit. He said it was like lending a neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire. You would do it, right? Well, isolationists really didn't like this because it was leaning more and more toward Britain. But by then, the majority of U.S. opinion had shifted toward aiding Britain, and the Lend-Lease Act was signed law in March of 1941, really helping Britain in the war effort. Over at home, a federal agency called the Office of Price Administration tried to regulate civilians' lives by freezing prices, wages, and rents of things to combat wartime inflation. Of course, in Europe, they couldn't produce much during this time, so that drove up the cost of U.S. goods, and the cost of U.S. goods in the United States increased as well. Commodities, or commonly used goods, were the ones that were most censored and regulated during this time. Another policy was the Bracero Program. Many Mexican Americans had worked in the U.S. defense industries and also served in the military. So in 1942, an agreement with Mexico allowed Mexican farm workers, known as braceros, to enter during the harvest season of the United States without going through formal immigration procedures. When they came to the U.S., they would take jobs such as picking fruit in California and other food-related goods to try to increase U.S. food production. This sudden influx of Mexican immigrants really caused race riots and resentments among whites, especially in places such as Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, for example, these people even battled on the streets. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed the U.S. naval fleet in the Pacific anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Almost 2,500 Americans were killed, and a fear of the Japanese being spies or saboteurs ensued. In 1942, these irrational fears and racism by whites prompted the U.S. government to move over 100,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast and move them into internment camps that were more inland from the Pacific coast. In places like Hawaii, though, this order did not come true. In the case of Korematsu versus the U.S. in 1944, the Supreme Court said that the U.S. government's wartime policy was justified because it was for national security reasons. However, years later, the federal government ruled that the ruling was actually unjust and even gave financial compensation to those who were alive and had been interned. The WWII campaign was a drive and slogan to try to promote the fight for democracy in overseas campaigns and at the home front, especially for African Americans during World War II. African Americans were trying to achieve two V's during this time: a victory for the United States in the World War, and also a victory for their rights and citizenship back home, because during this time there were still many segregationist and racist policies. The U.S. entered the war in two fronts, the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Atlantic theater really dealt with battles in Europe. So the British and Americans, now together on the Allied side, had two objectives in 1942, beating the German submarines and also bombing the German cities. A naval war was fought to control the shipping lanes in and around the English Channel between England and France, and this was known as the Battle of the Atlantic. The British and the Americans were able to beat German submarines through the use of radar, sonar, and bombing of German naval bases. These were all new technologies at the time and really helped the Americans and British have an advantage. Also, U.S. bombers, so finally planes starting to become flying targets, carried out daylight strategic bombing raids on military targets in Europe to try to force the factories to go out of production, especially in Germany. Sooner, though, the lines between military and civilian targets became blurred as the war carried on, especially in Japan, because in many countries they were mobilizing their civilians to aid in the war effort, and this was kind of hard for Americans to distinguish. The Allied drive to liberate France began on June 6, 1944, with the largest invasion by sea in history. This was known as the D-Day invasion. British, Canadian, and U.S. forces flew in from Britain under the command of General Eisenhower and parachuted onto the beaches of Normandy, France, which is about right here. It was very bloody but also successful, and by the end of August, Paris was actually liberated. And by September, Allied troops had crossed the German border to finally push toward the capital of Berlin. The Germans, however, wouldn't give out without a fight, and they launched a desperate counterattack in Belgium, which they controlled at this time, seen right there. And in December 1944, in the Battle of Bulge, which was a very snowy battle, the Germans were not able to successfully push back the French, the British, and the Americans, and eventually Germany lost out in Europe. So this is the Battle of the Atlantic, followed by the D-Day invasion by submarines and also amphibious boats, and this is the big tank battles of the Battle of the Bulge. In the Pacific theater, it was mostly Japan battling America, and the war in the Pacific was dominated by these two big naval forces who battled a large area of the Pacific Ocean. The Americans were able to intercept and decode Japanese messages, and this enabled the U.S. forces to destroy many Japanese naval carriers and planes, especially in the decisive Battle of Midway on June 4th through the 7th. This battle eventually ended Japanese expansion and helped the U.S. gain some momentum in the Pacific. From then, they used a strategy called island hopping, basically hopping from island to island that the Japanese controlled, and they would take over these islands to get closer and closer to the mainland of Japan. The commanders bypassed strongly held Japanese posts and also isolated them with America's strong naval and air power. These allied forces, of course, were able to eventually gain much more land and get closer to Japan. Another big plus of this strategy was it allowed B-29 bombers, seen right here, to really move closer and be in range to bomb Japan. From there, these bombers were able to reach places in Japan and bomb them if necessary as a part of an offensive. Through island hopping, the Americans were able to capture many islands, such as Iwo Jima, which is the subject of this iconic American photo of Marines raising the flag. And they were also able to capture the island of Okinawa, which was really the last major battle of the Pacific for the Americans. After Okinawa, the United States was ready to attack Japan and invade it with a huge invasion force, but this was deemed very bad because heavy casualties were feared to ensue on both sides, the Japanese and the Americans. The US, though, had developed a frightfully destructive new weapon known as the atomic bomb. It actually began as a top-secret project known as the Manhattan Project that had begun in 1942 under the physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. The project employed over 100,000 people, was scattered all throughout the U.S. in top-secret locations, and cost $2 billion. This atomic bomb was successfully tested in 1945 in New Mexico, seen right here. And by then, the United States had to make a big decision about whether to use it or not. By this time, FDR had actually died, and Harry Truman became the new president. So Truman and his wartime allies really wanted Japan to surrender and call an end to this war, but Japan said no. So Truman didn't want to waste his forces or have lots of killing on both sides, so he decided to use this new weapon on 2 atomic cities. The first bomb was dropped on August 6th in the port city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, which was also a port city in Japan. About 250,000 Japanese died, and it was just due to the sheer force and destruction of these bombs. Afterward, many more people died or suffered from radioactive sickness because of the prolonged period of exposure they had to all the radiation that came after the bombings. Nuclear fallout was a big issue after the bombings. During the war, many countries had tried to end the war early, and among these, there were the Big Three, which were the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. They secretly met to coordinate their military strategies and lay the foundation for peace terms after the war. The first conference included only Roosevelt and Churchill, and they decided on a grand strategy to invade Sicily and Italy, who were part of the Axis powers, and demand unconditional surrender from the Axis powers. This was known as the Casablanca Conference. Following that, there was the Tehran Conference, which was in Iran. The Big Three met for the first time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, and they met in November 1943, so 2 years before the war ended. The British and Americans began their drive to liberate France in the spring of 1944, so right after this, and eventually the Soviets agreed to join the war against Japan for the United States after they had defeated Germany on the eastern side of Europe. A third conference was the Yalta Conference. This happened in February of 1945 at Yalta, which was a resort town on the Black Sea in the Soviet Union. Out of the conferences, this was the most historic. The conditions for after the war would be that Germany would be divided into occupation zones, some by the Soviet Union, some by France, some by Britain, some by the United States. There would also be free elections in countries of Eastern Europe, even though the Soviet troops and communism had controlled this territory. The Soviets would also enter the war against Japan, which they did when Japan was about to surrender, and the Soviets would be able to control parts of the Pacific and Manchuria, which is like northern China. As a result of the war, they took these lands away from Japan. Finally, the most notable was probably a new world peace organization, the future United Nations, that came after the League of Nations had failed. This would be formed later at a conference in San Francisco. In late July, Stalin was the only remainder of these Big Three because FDR had died and Britain had elected a new prime minister. The three leaders of these countries, however, still met at the Potsdam Conference in late July and August, and they agreed to demand that Japan surrender unconditionally because they hadn't surrendered yet, and also to hold war crime trials of Nazi leaders who had surrendered months earlier in Germany. With that was pretty much the end of World War II. So this has been Chapter 25 of AMSCO US History, Diplomacy and World War II. Thanks so much for watching, and if you want to learn more about World War II, make sure you check out the World History video on World War II right below. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.